In Section 5, we're going to focus our time on congruent angles and talk about what it means for angles to be congruent, how to mark them, and how to solve for angles that are congruent. So let's start with the definition and the key concept. The statement says angles that have the same measure are congruent angles. So again, angles that have the same measure are congruent angles. Arcs on the figure also indicate which angles are congruent. So what they mean by arcs is these marks right here. Since I have one mark on each, I know that these two are congruent to each other. You might also see it if there's multiple congruent angles in the same picture, 2 arcs or 3 arcs. As long as the number of arcs match on each angle, then they're congruent to each other. Let's start with this first example. Directions say, state whether each pair of angles is congruent, and if so, write a congruence statement. So it looks like we have angles that are congruent at 47 degrees. Let me put those congruent marks in there. Remember, to write an angle, the vertex goes in the middle. So we're going to say angle BAD. Remember, the congruency sign is equals with a tilde above it. And then on the next one, we need O to be in the middle. So angle TOH. Part B, we have congruency marks at this angle. There's 2 and there's 2 here, so we know those are congruent, even if they don't give us the measure. So we can say angle FAT is congruent to angle BIG. Example 2, find the value of x and the measure of one angle. So looking at this picture in example 2, you can already tell me that these 2 angles are congruent. And if we want to write that out, we could always say angle ABC. So again, this angle right here, ABC, is congruent to angle DBF. We need to do some algebra though. Let me erase what I have over here on the left. We need to figure out the value of x first. Since these 2 angles are congruent, congruency means equivalency. We can set those angles equal to each other. Well, what is angle ABC? 6x plus 2. What is angle DBF? 8x minus 14. Now we'll just solve this algebraically. I will subtract 6x to get the x's on the same side. Since the x is on the right, I'm going to add 14 over, so it's on the left. And then divide by 2. So I have x equals 8. That was the first part of the instructions, find the value of x. I set them equal to each other and got x was 8. Now it says find the measure of one angle. Well, either one works. If we know one, we know the other because they're congruent. So maybe I'll find the measure of angle ABC. We know ABC is 6x plus 2. I will take x. We just found that to be 8, right? I'm just going to plug it in. Well, 6 times 8 is 48. 48 and 2 gives me a value of 50. So I know angle ABC is 50. The second part of this video, we're going to talk about what's called an angle bisector. All an angle bisector is a ray that divides an angle into two congruent angles. It's a ray that divides an angle into two congruent angles. So if we look at the picture and then fill in this sentence to the right, if ray PQ, so this one, remember, a ray has an endpoint and then continues off infinitely in the other direction. If ray PQ is an angle bisector of the big angle, well, this big angle is angle RPS. Then what do we know? Well, let me erase this. If it's an angle bisector, we know for a fact that these two angles are congruent, hence the congruency marks. So we know that angle RPQ, this one on the left side, is congruent to angle SPQ. Again, we know those two angles are congruent if PQ is that angle bisector. Let's use that information to do example 3. So in example 3, we have ray QP and QR that are opposite rays. Ray QT bisects RQS. So that's a lot of information to take in right there. Take a moment and think about that. Well, part A focuses on a few of these angles. It says if the measure of angle RQT, if you haven't seen that little M, that just means the measure of that angle is 6x plus 5. So RQT, 6x plus 5, goes right in there. And SQT, 7x minus 2. So 7x minus 2, and that goes right down in there. Then find the measure of RQT. So we actually want to find this value, not in terms of x, but in terms of its actual angle. What is the angle of that? Well, the key here is that we know that in the second statement up above, ray QT bisects angle RQS. So we know that the ray QT bisects this large angle RQS. And that's what we need to determine that this is congruent to this. These two angles that we're looking for are congruent to each other. That means we can just set them equal. We can say 7x minus 2 equals 6x plus 5 because of the angle bisector. Just algebra from here. I'll subtract 6x. And then I'm going to add 2. So I get x equals 7. And actually, let me put that up above. X equals 7. So that's our x value. Again, it says to find the measure of RQT. So the measure of angle RQT means we need to plug 7 in. 6 times 7 plus 5. And 6 times 7 plus 5 will give us 42, and then add 5 more to it. 40, whoops. Let me choose the pen option. 47 degrees. Part B says find the measure of TQS if RQS is 22A minus 11 and the measure of RQT is 12A minus 8. So it wants us to find TQS I'll highlight that in blue. We know RQS, this whole measure, is, let's put it down here, 22a minus 11. And that's this whole thing. We also know RQT, that's just this small guy right in here, RQT, 12a minus 8. Because of our angle bisector, just a reminder, we know that angle TQS plus angle RQT equals angle RQS. In other words, the smaller angle plus the smaller angle equals the whole angle, because QT is the angle bisector. So let's fill in what we know and eventually solve for TQS. RQT is given 12a minus 8 RQS 22a minus 11, and TQS. Well, we actually know what TQS is because, as we established before, it's congruent to RQT. So I'm just going to call it 12a minus 8 again. We know those are the same angles, so I'm just going to add them together. Or you could just double it. Either way. So I have on the left side 12 and 12 give me 24 A's. Negative 8 minus 16 equals 22A minus 11. Let me subtract 22A. I'm also going to add 16 just because I'm running out of room. Well, these cancel. 24A minus 22A is 2A. Negative 11 plus 16 is 5. Divide both sides by 2. So I divide that by 2 and divide that by 2. I get A equals to 5 halves, or we'll just say it's 2.5. So we found A. And again, we need to know TQS. TQS, that 12A minus 8. That's angle TQS. So 12 times 2.5 minus 8. 12 times 2.5 gives you 30. 30 minus 8. 22 degrees. And for our last example, in figure, we have YU that bisects ZYW and YT that bisects XYW. So looking at this, maybe before we even do anything, we can determine which angles are congruent. If we know YU, boom, bisects ZYW, then I know these two are congruent. So let me go back and just make that nice and neat. We have this congruent to this. I also know YT bisects, let's see, XYW. So again, we have angles 1 and angles 2 congruent. More congruent segments. This time I'm going to mark them as the double congruent mark to know that these two are congruent to each other only. Now let's look at example A. If the measure of angle 1, 5x plus 10, the measure of angle 2 is 8x minus 23, find the measure of angle 2. Well, this goes back to what we just did. We marked angle 1 and angle 2 congruent. Since the measure of angle 1 equals the measure of angle 2, I should say they're congruent, so that means the values are equal. 5x plus 10 equals 8x minus 23. Going to solve, subtract 5x. 10 equals 3x minus 23. I'm going to add 23. And then let me finish it up here. 10 plus 23 is 33. And then these cancel, so I'm left with 3x on the right. Divide by 3. X equals 11. Just like we've done in all the other examples, we know x, we have to plug it back in. It says find the measure of angle 2. The measure of angle 2 is this expression right now, 8x minus 23. That means we need to plug in our 11, and we get 8 times 11, which is 88. 88 minus 23, which is 65. 65 degrees. This is our final value for angle 2. So for part B, it says the measure of WYZ is 82. The measure of ZYU is 4R plus 25. Find R. So we've got WYZ right here. Let me erase what I just did there. Whoops. WYZ, 82. And then we want to know the half of that angle, the left portion of that bisector, ZYU, 4R plus 25. So what we can say here, and what I would say, is that we have those two small angles, this angle and this angle, added up to give us that full angle. But we know 1 and 2 are congruent. So I'm going to say the measure of angle ZYU times 2, if I just double that, because these two are the same angle, equals the measure of angle WYZ, the big one. So filling in the information from there, 2 times what's ZYU, 4R plus 25, equals what's WYZ, 82. From here I can distribute the 2, 8R plus 50 equals 82. Work on solving for R, subtract 50. 8R equals 32. Divide through by 8. R equals 4. And that's actually what we're looking for here, just the value of R. So we know in this problem, R must be 4. So this is all that's due for today's assignment. Tomorrow, in class, I'll pull our whole class out and we can work on the Section 5 assignment itself. So just make sure you have these notes done, bring them to class tomorrow, and we'll do the assignment all together.